I'm delighted to welcome you to the second of two webinars that we are doing between the Brookings Center on the United States and Europe and the Clingendael Institute, the Dutch premier think tank in The Hague. My name is Constanze Stelzenmüller. I'm a senior fellow at the center. And we just had a very interesting closed roundtable discussing the issue of transatlantic cooperation on global public goods in an era of renewal on the American side and hopefully also on the European side. I want to say at the outset that this undertaking has been funded by the municipality of The Hague, and is usually combined during the year with a lecture in Washington, D.C. named after Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, which we very sadly had to postpone. It was the very first thing Brookings had to postpone in early April because of the pandemic. We would have had the distinguished Pakistani human rights advocate Hina Gilani speaking to us. And we've all decided to postpone this to a time when we can all meet again in person. The first thing I want to do before I introduce you to our panel is to let you see a brief welcoming message from the representative of our funders, Deputy Mayor of The Hague, Saskia Bruinis, and I hope I pronounced that correctly. And you can show the video now. That would be our partners in The Hague who have to show it.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on what time zone you are in. Welcome in The Hague. As a Deputy Mayor for International Affairs, I have a keen interest in today's topic. How can we strengthen the foundations of the Atlantic Bridge between the US and Europe? President-elect Biden promises the US will recommit to the Paris Agreement and the World Health Organization. But it's not only the United States that have work to do in strengthening ties. We all have to evaluate our role in the world. Democracy is under pressure everywhere. In his recent memoirs, President Obama writes that democracy is on the brink of a crisis. We should all share his sense of urgency. As the international city of peace and justice, democracy is rooted in The Hague's DNA. As host city of the first peace conferences in 1899 and 1907, we have always provided a platform to make progress in the field of international law possible. Today, The Hague is the proud home of more than 300 international organizations and NGOs with a proven track record in creating a better world. However, achieving justice requires more than just the establishment of institutions. It's necessary to network and connect at a local and international level. The Hague will continue to offer itself as a hub for discussions on democracy and the rule of law, even in these virtual corona times. Ladies and gentlemen, whenever I speak about this subject, I feel Eleanor Roosevelt is looking over my shoulders. As she put it, without concerned citizen action to uphold rights close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. In small places, close to home. So close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. I am grateful to the Brookings Institute and the Clingendael Institute for cooperating with the Netherlands Embassy in Washington and the municipality of The Hague in organizing this important discussion. I wish you all an inspiring session. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to our Dutch partners for organizing that. And thank you to Saskia Bruinis and the municipality of The Hague that is funding this cooperation. And it's a useful reminder just how intense the involvement and how long the role of smaller European nations with a robustly global outlook for centuries has been in the development of the global order, even in pre-modern times, but then again in modern times, with hosting not just the Hague Court of Justice, the chief court of the United Nations, but also the International Criminal Court and the special courts for war crimes in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda. In that way, the Netherlands have really had an outsized role in the development of global order and global legal norms. And I think that's a useful reminder. So what we're going to talk about today is, again, transatlantic cooperation on global public goods. And I want to introduce our distinguished panel. Our two speakers are Louise van Schaik, the head of EU and Global Affairs at the Clingendael Institute, and my colleague and center director, Thomas Wright, director of the Center on the US at the Brookings Institution and senior fellow. And the way we're going to do this is we will have a 40 minutes moderated conversation between Tom and Louise, after which we will have 20 minutes Q&A from our audience, which will be fielded by Thies Dams, who is also the co-author with Louise of a recent report for the European Parliament, which I have right here, No Way Back, Why the Transatlantic Future Needs a Stronger EU. And all of this is on the record, and I will start by asking both of you, if I may, and I'll start with you, Tom, to give us an elevator pitch on the value, Tom, of the US to Europe. If you I don't know whether you had a time to look at Louise and Tams's report. It, I think, is shot through with, I would say, the trauma of the past 4 years of the Trump administration, and also some robust Dutch skepticism, also articulated in a very frank Dutch way, about just how much it will be possible to do together between America and Europe in these times. So what is the worth of transatlantic cooperation to skeptic Europeans? Elevator pitch, so 3 minutes max, I would say.
That's a very long elevator ride, but I will do my best.
Okay, make it shorter.
We're in a skyscraper. It's great to be here, Louise and Thies. Great to be on a panel with you both, and congratulations on the paper, which I really liked. To Constanze's question, I fully understand sort of the skepticism. I think particularly of the last 4 years, but also perhaps of the last 20. I mean, we've been talking obviously about a transatlantic rift for some time. It's very acute during the George W. Bush administration. Even in the Obama administration, there was concerns not about really a disalignment of values and interests, but about the US shifting toward Asia, maybe being less focused on Europe. And I think the pandemic honestly really exacerbates all of this, because it really reminds Europeans that they cannot rely on other powers to protect their interests. They have to focus on their own strength, and whether we call that autonomy or something else, I think there's more than a kernel of truth to that. My point, though, would be that as we look at the world, that there is sort of an ideological divide, even if we don't call it that, between two different systems of governance, a liberal democratic system of governance, and a more authoritarian system of governance. Now, the authoritarianism obviously represented by China and by Russia, but also by nationalist populist voices within our own societies, right? As we're seeing here, sort of in the US at the moment. But I think if you look at Trump's own personal view on things, he tends to see the world a little bit more like some of the authoritarian strongmen than maybe Angela Merkel would or Emmanuel Macron would. So these lines are blurred a little bit, but I think they do very much pertain to how we tackle sort of modern challenges, whether it's global public health and the need for transparency, whether it's technology and data questions, and whether or not it's resisting coercion attempts, as Australia is facing at the moment from China, and as European countries have also faced from a variety of countries. All of those things, I think, are things that democracies could only really handle together. And so my sort of elevator pitch, Constanze, I guess, would be that what we need to do is to show that democracies working together, and the US and Europe being at the core of that, can actually fundamentally affect international relations and politics and international cooperation in a way that directly benefits people, right? This is not just about South China Sea or, you know, or Crimea and Eastern Ukraine and all of these areas where you have geopolitical clashes. It's fundamentally about the type of life that people live and whether or not their anxieties about the global level can be addressed. And I think the only way we can address those is essentially together, and that there aren't alternative, better partners out there for the US and for Europe other than each other and Asian democracies as well, which I think are an important piece of it. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much, Tom. And I'm glad you sort of mentioned the Asian democracies at the end. I would add perhaps also civil societies in countries that are authoritarian run. We have seen in Poland and in Hungary, but also in the Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, civil societies that are very much you know, trying to reach out and hoping for support from Western democracies. By the way, I have a bunch of workers up in the apartment up above me who are doing renovations and having the radio blaring very loudly. I hope that doesn't come over on this event. Good. I'm glad to see you shaking your heads. It's a bit strange here. I will move over to you, Louise, please, and ask you, what would your elevator pitch be for convincing skeptical Europeans? And again, this is a skepticism that comes through loud and clear, and all of us Europeans, I'm a German, know how hard it has become to argue for transatlantic cooperation in the last 4 years. How do you convince, conversely, and this is now, I'm going to move to the other side. How do you convince Americans, skeptical Americans, of the value of Europe to their purposes? What's your pitch?
Well, I agree very much with Tom that the essence is about that we need to demonstrate in the current world order that democracy works. That if you trust the people to bring their votes every 4 or 5 years, that this will allow them to choose their own leaders and their own political programs, their own policies. Democracy isn't perfect, but it's a completely different system than an autocratic system, a party in the lead system, a dictatorship. And I think we have to showcase also in this pandemic its worth and our belief in its working, and that's essentially the essence, because we are the biggest democracies, the European part and the US. Of course, there's others: Canada, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and so on and so forth in Latin America, in Africa. But I think we are the biggest and the most powerful ones. Why should the US care about Europe? Because Europe is by far its biggest trading partner, and it's also the biggest trading bloc in the world. It's also the world, and we share a lot in terms of historical and cultural ties, in addition to democracy. Not in all European countries, but in most European countries, we still have a fully fledged democracy. So I think this is very important to realize, and we're also very supportive of doing things together internationally, because we have this, you know, multilateralism in our DNA. Sometimes maybe we're even a bit naive in this, but at least, you know, you can count on us when it comes to promoting policies at the international level, combating global challenges, and also investing in the multilateral system financially. I think I'll leave it here. There's more to talk about later.
Thank you very much. I think one of the issues that we might want to raise during discussion is also the degree to which Europe is willing and able to provide leverage for common purposes where we're dealing with autocratic large rivals who are also important trading partners for us, or sources of energy, meaning China and Russia, and whether we are in fact able to provide the European cohesion that would be necessary to do all that. I mean, we're in a crucial week for the future of Europe, where we are discussing Brexit, where we are discussing whether to exclude European countries that we feel do not live up to the rule of law as codified in European treaties from the European Recovery Fund. And that in turn has a consequence for the funding of the EU in coming years in the middle of a historic recession. But we'll come to that. Let me perhaps, I think it would be helpful if we could address a couple of quite specific public goods that we have to work on urgently. And obviously the first one here is global public health. As we on both sides of the Atlantic are seeing a massive spike in pandemics with huge, and I think at this point, unquantifiable implications for our national orders and our relationship. Tom, you've been working on a book with Colin Carl on global public health. Do you want to start us off here? Where do you think we should most urgently act together, and what are possible red lines and risks?
Yeah, thanks, Constanze. I think the most interesting thing and disturbing thing about the COVID-19 crisis, is that it occurred in an era of sort of nationalist populism where there was virtually no international cooperation. And, the global public health expert, Laurie Garrett, recently said, in all of the exercises that she participated in planning for a pandemic, not a single one assumed that the President of the United States would be actively sabotaging the effort, although that's what's happened. And in China, of course, we had, I think, after a decade and a half of hope that there was reform on their side and that they will be more transparent, and that they went back to the more secretive and repressive practices of the SARS sort of era and response in 2003, and raised real questions about whether or not that cooperation with them had worked or been effective. And obviously we've seen shortcomings in the WHO, and I think more worryingly, even the global population, particularly in Western countries, is divided. I mean, you have a significant number of people in the United States who don't believe the pandemic is all that serious and don't believe in wearing masks or doing simple mitigation measures. And the reason all of this, I think, is a big problem is because this is not the last pandemic, right? Given what is happening around the world and a variety of different developments, we can expect future pandemics of different severity. One in the future could be worse, it could be more fatal than COVID-19 and as contagious. And so we really need to prepare now on that. So I think the incoming Biden administration, there's a long list of things they can do in the first few weeks, including joining COVAX and ACTA and recommitting to the WHO and having a G20 summit to try to, address the global recovery piece of this. But over the medium to long term, there are real questions, I think, of how do we have a real accounting for what happened over the last sort of 10 years and learn all of the tough lessons, because there are easy villains here, but there are also mistakes that a lot of institutions made. For instance, the WHO was very skeptical of travel restrictions coming into this, whereas now that will be seen as quite important. So I think we have a lot to do and we need to do it cooperatively and globally. But ultimately, we maybe also need to work in more coalitions of the like-minded when not everyone comes along. And we need to think about politics being an obstacle in the next crisis as well as in the past one.
Tom, let me follow up on that, if I may. I think you and I were at the last Munich Security Conference together, where one of the speakers, there was a keynote by the head of the WHO, if you'll recall, which was
side room, I think, not on the main stage. Yeah.
Well, it was if I recall correctly, remarkably, shall we say, pro-Chinese. And you know what I'm getting at. How do we deal with the fact that that China, for a variety of reasons, including, I think, a dereliction of attention by Western governments, not least the United States, but I would also say not only the United States, has very successfully, effectively inserted itself in key UN organizations, and is managing now to shape the rules to its liking. How do we deal with that, given that we also need Chinese cooperation on these key issues?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I just make a couple of points in response. Firstly, while I would be critical of the WHO, I think it's also important to remember that internally there was a lot of concern inside the WHO about what China was doing. And
Yep.
They felt that they needed to be publicly praising in order to get access. Now, Tedros, I think, was at the far end of that, and he was maybe more inclined to take China's word for it. But it was a mixed picture inside the WHO. And the reason that's important, Constanze, is because the Trump administration could have chosen to work with its allies inside the WHO to put pressure on China and to build a global coalition within, or a coalition of the like-minded within the WHO structures. It didn't do that, it chose to leave instead. So the WHO is complicated, but it's not a lost cause. I think it's worth sort of fighting for. I think you do put your finger on a very crucial point, which is, it's hard for me to imagine Xi Jinping ever agreeing to the level of transparency required to allow the international community access in the early stages of a pandemic. So what we need to do, I think, is think more about how do we get the WHO to have the type of powers that we associate with the International Atomic Energy Association, right, for intrusive inspections and the like. Now that seems very far-fetched, and I think it is far-fetched, but you could imagine if there's a future pandemic, that if Europe and Japan and the United States and Australia and Vietnam maybe and many others who handle this pretty well, South Korea, came together and said, if you don't allow access, then we will put in place these containment measures immediately because we can't allow this to spread until you prove otherwise. That could be the type of, that could provide the type of teeth required to actually generate a more transparent and cooperative response. So I think we need to be thinking about leverage, and we need to be thinking about a lack of cooperation, as well as sort of the universal aspect, which is also obviously very important in bringing China into the fold there too.
Right. Thank you very much, Tom. Well, over to you, Louise. And let's stay with the topic of global health for a moment. I mean, you point out in your report that the pandemic has highlighted divisions in the Western world, but it's also highlighted them in Europe. One of the first things that happened in Europe at the beginning of the pandemic is that, I'm sorry, I'm grinning because the workers above me are clearly trying to scrape the floor right over my head. All of the European states closed their borders against each other. And you, as sitting in the Netherlands, know how incredibly important cross-border labor movement is on a daily basis between the Netherlands and Belgium, the Netherlands and Germany and France. This was disastrous for not just for European sort of citizens and economies on an immediate basis, but also disastrous for a sense of European unity and cohesion. How do we how do we deal with this issue in the future in Europe? Because as Tom says, we are sure to see more pandemics.
Yeah, it was clear that there was a lot of coro-nationalism, as it was called, in the EU, and also that everybody was really a bit shocked by that. But I guess in the end of the day, because in so many countries we had lockdowns that we could hardly leave our house, then, you know, crossing borders is also not that important. Well, in a longer term perspective, perhaps yes, but and fortunately also the borders were reopened, well, relatively quickly again. But it was also that sometimes the measures were taken without, you know, informing your neighbors. That was a bit shocking. If you allow me, I would like to say just a few words about the WHO. Because we had actually our minister Sigrid Kaag in another webinar at Clingendael in April. It was one of our first webinars.
WTO or the WHO?
W on global health, on the World Health Organization. Right. And we asked her this exact question, you know, should the World Health Organization also have weapon inspectors? Like she, you know, went into Syria herself for the UN to get out the chemical weapons. Super sensitive. Could you envisage something like this under the international health regulations of the World Health Organization, and then, you know, avoid the situation as it unfolded at the beginning of 2020 in China? But she was also very cautious, I think, in her answer. I mean, the webinar is available online. People can still watch it. She was also very cautious. And I also think that this is a huge dilemma, because on the one hand, you really want, you know, the US and the EU, they want now to reform the World Health Organization for the first time, perhaps in its history, or at least in the past 20 years, they take the organization serious because in all honesty, they have really neglected it. And under the Obama government, you had the Global Health Security Agenda, which was one of these alternatives to the UN, and which was also not liked by other countries in the world, because they saw it as a Western, you know, initiative. And that's one of the big dilemmas that we have now with regard to the multilateral system. Are we going to, you know, support multilateral institutions in the UN, which have become more Chinese? Or are we going to go back to setting up the alternative transnationalist mechanisms? And also for some fields, it might be more difficult to establish new, you know, typical UN-style agencies if it comes to data or privacy-related issues, because we have so many more autocracies in this world. So I think the whole World Health Organization case is super emblematic for, let's say, the wider state of UN agencies in this world. And that has become really clear, but also the need for the transatlantic countries to cooperate, because indeed, otherwise we will not have enough clout to make that reform. I mean, the EU tried at the World Health Assembly with its resolution and with, you know, catalyzing the ACT and COVAX facility, but we could really use the help of the US, I guess, in this matter.
By the way, I just want to say, if you two want to sort of butt in and ask each other questions, please feel free. I don't want to be the only one directing this conversation. This should be as informal as possible. But I do want to ask you, Louise, given what you and Tom have both said about the difficulties of managing of finding workable sort of policy coalitions at a UN level when non-Western, non-democratic powers have been quite successful in shaping policy and setting up constraints for Western democracies. Doesn't that mean, Louise, that we ought to create structures on the European side that prevent them from splitting each other when it matters? The Chinese have become very successful at inserting themselves in European policy debates when they are worried that we might cohere too much. So, and I notice that this is something you don't really discuss in your report. Is global health and health policy an area where there ought to be more European integration? It's not traditionally been a field of European integration because it's considered domestic policy. Do you have a position on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there should, well, there are efforts now for the Health Union, and also there were council conclusions on global health again. The last ones were from 2010, and they were quickly forgotten, as we have pointed out in some of the publications. But it's absolutely a field where the EU should step up its game, and take more outspoken positions. What we have seen in the pandemic indeed is all these ridiculously nationalized responses, each country with their own health institutes, their own national distancing policies. Well, what you've probably also seen in the US between the federal and the state level, that there were these divergences of how to approach this. And I think we could benefit a lot from Europeanization also in this field, also with regard to patient rights and other issues. Steps have been made. But I guess more is possible in this regard.
Louise, where do you see Dutch politics on this? You also have a fairly effective populist movement, as have we all, which presumably would resist this. Do you think that your current government would be able to support such a move?
Yeah, in all honesty, I think the Netherlands is relatively absent in the discussions on European health and international health policy. We're not very outspoken. We struggle a lot with our own COVID response domestically, and I've been a bit I've been a bit ashamed actually of my own country's absence in this field. So, to be honest with you.
Well, I didn't want to put you sort of on the spot here. I would have similar issues on Germany, and I'm sure if there were more Europeans on this call, we would all pitch in with criticisms of what's happening in our own field, but and in our own national domains. Let me ask you, since we have about 10 minutes more before we go to Q&A, what do you think, besides the urgent matter of climate change, are the sort of low-hanging fruit on global public goods that Europe and America could work on together before domestic constraints of one form or another kick in? Tom, let me start with you.
Thanks. I would just say, just to follow on just from one thing Louise said, I think to me, the European Union has actually dealt with the pandemic pretty well. It's interesting that on this occasion with the second wave, borders weren't closed, whereas they were the first time round. And there wasn't the same type of scramble for critical medical supplies, with countries stealing each other's supplies and generally, having a beggar thy neighbor approach. That didn't occur.
Picking up stuff at airports, yes.
And March and April was a pretty traumatic time for everyone, I think. So, we can sort of chalk that up to just human nature and what happened all over the world. But I think the way the EU has sort of evolved since has been positive, and they've learned sort of important lessons. And, the federal structure is something that occurs all over the world also. I mean, in Australia, which has handled it pretty well, they have problems too with the different, constituent parts of the country not being able to get a single policy that they've had to deal with. Here in the US, of course, we've had something in Germany, of course, there's a federal system. So there's all sorts of, what's happened at the European level, I think, is not very atypical. So I'm somewhat encouraged, I would just say. But on your question, Constanze, I mean, none of this, I think, is low-hanging fruit, because it's all very hard, particularly on climate. But the one I would sort of draw attention to is, I think, with the global, I don't know if this technically qualifies as a global public good, but on globalization and the global economy, we now know over the last 10 years that people have real anxieties about many aspects of the global economy. Some of this is feeding populism inside our own countries. There's all sorts of different effects of it. We have generally, as a transatlantic community, focused our foreign economic policy on increasing openness and tariff reduction, regulatory alignment. I think the time has come to really try to tackle some of those key anxieties. that people have. So whether or not it's the international tax regime and the way in which some companies, don't pay tax anywhere at any point, whether it's climate economics, whether or not it's data issues, or how to have an industrial policy to ensure that our societies are competitive with Chinese technological companies like ZTE and Huawei. There's a number of things that can be done as a community and also more broadly with other democracies to ensure that international economic order is actually seen as a benefit for citizens in their everyday lives and not something that's sort of abstract or funneled through the interests of corporations.
Well, interestingly, we've learned that the current president of the United States is in agreement with you on at least one very at least one. I mean, it's a rare instance, but at least one major social media company. But what do you, Tom? Let me push this back at you. What do you think is realistic here? I mean, these aren't new issues. And the pandemic and its economic consequences, which I think we are far from being able to quantify yet at this point, is going to increase pressures for protectionism and nationalism. How do you square that circle practically? And how do you, particularly if you, I mean, we're now seeing an incumbent president who is making it clear that there is going to be opposition against the incoming Biden administration, not just from day one as we thought, but before day one. And we also, I think, have a distinct risk of the Senate staying in Republican hands, and maybe in the 2022 midterms, the Congress becoming Republican as well, given how narrow the margins of some of the Democrats were. How realistic is it that we, in what may just be a window of opportunity that's 18, 20 months long, that we can find a measure of any of the ones that you've named: digital taxation, climate economics, data issues, industrial policy, where we can build a transatlantic approach that is resilient against populist pressures?
Yeah, well, there's a lot there, Constanze. I guess on the first, I'll get to the Senate piece in a second, but I would just encourage everyone not to adopt sort of a dichotomous choice between openness on the one hand and protectionism on the other, and that anything that is not an old style FTA is protectionist, or a resilient agenda in response to the pandemic is protectionist. I think what we need are a series of sort of outcome-focused cooperative efforts, a little bit like maybe the Proliferation Security Initiative back after 9/11, right, where you have sort of an outcome-focused coalition that tackles real problems, let's say on technology and other issues, that begins to generate sort of results. And we shouldn't tie ourselves up too much with over institutionalizing this or trying to make it part of a major multilateral. Let's accumulate a lot of different wins on these areas and then see where we are. So that would be just my advice on that. I think your point on the Republicans is very well taken, and I think it's a huge issue. I think there is one simple answer, which may not be the right answer, but I think it probably is, which is that the only way to get a Trumpian Republican Party on board for internationalism is to make a significant piece of it about responding to China, right? That's literally the only way that you're going to get a bipartisan consensus. It's the only way you're going to get bipartisan engagement in international institutions to compete for sort of liberal values. It's the only way you're going to get support really for, I think, for NATO in the future from Trumpian Republicans. And the question that we have is, as just a community, is that something that we think is A, justified on the merits, and B, something that we can manage in a way that it doesn't sort of spiral into something we don't want? Yeah. And if not, then what is the cost of having only one party basically supporting an internationalist agenda?
Exactly.
And my view is that it's doable. I think it is to.
Right, right. Let me move right over to you, Louise, because that is a problem that structurally exists in Europe as well, not just because of the divisions between European countries, but within them. What do you think is the outlook for a constructive cooperation within the next 18-20 months? Can you tell us one or two examples that you've also listed in your report, where you think it might be possible to come to an agreement quickly that doesn't then get immediately torpedoed within Europe from the shutdown from our side? What do you think?
Yeah, I think there's also a few topics that we haven't explicitly listed in our report that might be, areas where we could step up cooperation, which could, for instance, include space governance or geoengineering. So should we, fiddle in the atmosphere to save the climate? But then if we do that, do we allow everybody to do that? Or so there is a number of issues that have been identified over the past years on global public goods that could be addressed and that are perhaps less, extremely politicized. I mean, in Europe, in Brussels, they say TTIP, is in the deep freezer. So nobody really dares to make another free trade agreement with the US because it was so sensitive with all the, standards for food safety, GMOs. There were such divides. So even with, Democrats, it's going to be difficult. So in our report, we talk about these examples of these mini deals in the field of trade, maybe different types of trade agreements, less focused on tariffs or less focused on safety, environmental and food safety standards. I guess there is a tendency both in the US now with the case to I don't know how to say it in English, to ask from Amazon to get rid of Instagram and WhatsApp.
Unbundle, yeah,
bundle.
break up the Amazon empire, yeah.
Yeah, but also the tendency with the elections, that you had all these warnings on Twitter, like this is false information, and Facebook, and I guess there is a big appetite in both the U.S. society, but also in the European society to codify some of that, to turn that into meaningful legislation that showcases that. We're not censoring, or we're not cutting free press, and we're not cutting privacy, but we're balancing off these things. So I guess there's a lot of issues where we can make meaningful new international agreements, deals that will really be also good for, let's say, selling the politicians to the domestic audiences.
So what I'm hearing you say, Louise, is that there are really, what we need to do is not sort of big eye-catching sort of catch-all agreements, but lots of small pragmatic fixes to specific problems, which, sounds reasonable to me. I am conscious of the passage of time, and Thies, you've been the one. You're the one collecting questions. You're also the co-author of this report on from Clingendael. So maybe you want to throw a couple of questions at us and tell us whom they are directed at.
Yeah, perfect. And actually, I think lots of the questions that had been sent in beforehand and indeed were asked during the session were also answered during the session. So I think we're really making headway. One that was touched upon, but I think we can have some more comments on, was asked during the seminar. And it's the question, basically, and I'm paraphrasing and simplifying a bit, what parts of the Trumpian critique of the EU itself, of the EU institutions, and EU policy ought we take seriously, and should the EU take on as maybe ambitions to improve in the years to come, even though the Trump administration is coming to an end? And actually, I would be interested to hear both your opinions on that.
That's actually an excellent question. Who wants to go first?
I can jump in. Look, I actually think this is one area where nothing that they said about the EU was accurate or helpful. I mean, I think it's important to sort of understand that they had virtually nobody. I mean, a couple of people I could mention, you know, Fiona, our colleague, Wes Mitchell, although he had particular views in the EU, but he did understand the EU, I think, to some extent. But by and large, the Trump administration didn't understand the EU at all. And the president particularly didn't understand it. And so he saw it primarily as an economic rival like China. I don't think he wanted it. I think he wanted it to break up, right? That's what he said at the beginning. I think that was his view throughout. He was heavily influenced by Nigel Farage. That was not obviously everyone in the administration, but for the most part, it was just a complete blind spot. So when they wanted to work on China together, after initially not turning to Europe at all, they turned to NATO at that point. And it was only at the very end that Pompeo sort of realized he needed to do this through the EU as well. And then they started something that never really got started, which is this dialogue that will continue next year. So I don't think there's a huge amount to be learned there. I think the overall lesson really is on the China account, which is that if the US wants to work with Europe on China, it has to do so with the EU. It can't just be with NATO, and it can't just be bilaterally. And that there is a strategic interest that the US has in the EU being a strong and effective actor on the world stage. That does not preclude a strong relationship with the UK as well, right? Helping the UK and the US-UK relationship now that they've left. But I think a strong EU is very much in America's interest. And that, in a way, I guess, is the opposite sort of approach that President Trump had anyway, even if he had a couple of people, I think, who had a more nuanced view.
Louise, do you agree?
Yeah, I do agree. I want to bring in an additional element, which is, I think that the EU indeed has a tendency not to be very self-critical, at least not the Brussels institutions, because, you know, there is not really a European demos holding them to account. And incidentally, we have these, you know, affairs like the Selmayr affair, the Selmayr Gate affair. But I guess, you know, the member of the European Parliament of the Orban party that was caught in an illegal homo party last weekend received more attention than the Selmayr Gate affair a few years ago, where it was far more severe and problematic. What I think is a trend in the past years is that, because probably also of the US neglect of the EU, but also because of other reasons, that you saw a huge rise of Germany and France as kind of spokespersons on behalf of the EU. And I'm personally really, really worried about that, not because I don't like Merkel and Macron. I think they're great European leaders, and I have a lot of respect for them. But I think it's worrisome that, let's say, two countries with, of course, a big population and tend, let's say, to overtake the EU, and the rest of the European countries seem to passively accept that. And also it leads to an hollowing out of the EU institutions as such, as spokespersons for the EU. So, for instance, today I went to the Politico website to see how they cover the European Council meeting of today and tomorrow. And then you see this photo of Merkel, Macron, von der Leyen, and it's just, you know, it's just, for me, it's too much. I mean, the EU is more than France and Germany, and I also hope that let's say the other European countries become more concerned about.
Louise, the Frugal Four were pretty important in the European recovery negotiations.
Yeah, for blocking things, but not for initiating new ideas and bringing in new impetus.
Fair enough. And size shouldn't be a hindrance for ideas. I mean, I tend to agree with you on both counts, if I may. I mean, I'm always concerned when the big two or big three in Europe sort of drown out the other ones. That's not helpful. But yeah, it's, I mean, the pandemic and its impact is of course, limiting the bandwidth and the energy that all countries have for new initiatives.
So my hope,
yeah,
if you allow me, would also be for the new Biden administration to look at the EU institutions and to engage them as their primary interlocutors, and to understand how the EU works internally, and also to consider perhaps, a few offers, maybe joining the EU connectivity answer as a joint answer to BRI, looking at the G5, at Ericsson and Nokia as European champions that could maybe help the shift to G5 in the US, things like this. So just to, to help also a bit this European understanding that it's Brussels that is in the lead and maybe not, especially also because there will be elections in Germany and France, so they will probably push more their own agendas even more
yes,
in the coming period. So I guess that's also something that I would hope for secretly.
The elections are a very good point. You will see both Germany and France being more inward looking, and there will be both space and a real need for other European countries to step up with initiatives. But I'm seeing the questions pile up. Thies, go for it.
So actually, there were quite a lot of questions on this last point that Louise has just hinted at, namely that since Obama's pivot to Asia and the more recent EU connectivity strategy, both transatlantic partners have clearly explicated a priority of engaging with Asia. Now, I think, and this is one of the reasons many questions came in on this, that's too big of a statement. So Asia is many, many things and many, many areas. Should we, will there be closer cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, specifically in Central Asia and the Middle East? So maybe to Thomas and Louisa, in this huge field of pivoting to Asia together, if not apart, what should be the specific priorities? And Louisa already said maybe the EU should invite the US to join its connectivity strategy. That's an interesting train of thought. But could we make that more specific so that in those first 18 months, something can be put on the agenda? Louisa, Thomas, maybe this is again.
How about stuff? Let's start with Louise.
Yeah, I think it's also clear in the article that Josep Borrell, the High Representative of the EU, just published in Foreign Policy, that he's really eyeing to the the Asia Pacific as it's called, but also to indeed to cooperate more with Japan, South Korea, and Australia. And also, I guess that the EU wants to step up its presence in the region. So I'm super curious to see if that would also include it in the debate on European defense, common security and defense policy, whether the EU is actually also going to consider that to go beyond, peacekeeping missions in the neighborhood countries, maybe also eventually include even the Arctic, but also the Indo-Pacific region. And we know, of course, that the US has this huge military base and is so concerned about the South China Sea issue. I'm hoping that the EU also becomes a bit more strategic about that in that respect. I leave it here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have a little bit of a different view in that, I mean, the US has huge strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific and obviously a major presence, key relationships. I think I don't see really how much, I'm not convinced that Europe's efforts are best placed in trying to play in that space, right? And to engage in FONOPs in the South China Sea and to build military ties. I mean, that all sounds fine and welcome, but I think it's a bit of a distraction from the key point, which is, competition with China is going to be in all of these domains that are not necessarily kinetic, right? There's a military dimension to it. The US is doing that with its allies in Asia. But on all of these issues, whether it's the economic side or especially on technology and 5G and AI and counter coercion, I would be much happier if Europe, focused on sort of those tech questions, on the counter coercion questions, on the working with the US, to put pressure on China in global economic reform, building those coalitions of like-minded, inoculating sort of the EU from the negative externalities of sort of the authoritarian system, whether it's in China or Russia or elsewhere. All of those, I think, are where Europe has real capability and a real possibility to affect the outcome. So I think that is, and also I think it is easier to make that case to the European public that they have a vested interest in action in those areas. Whereas, you know, being more of a geopolitical player in the Pacific, I think especially in a post-COVID era, just sounds very divorced from what a person would think their actual sort of interest and livelihood is about, right? So again, I like, you know, I would support any sort of more active role in Asia, but I think the main sort of focus is on those areas. And to do that, I think, Constanze and Louise, I think one thing, yes, by all means, build closer ties to Asian democracies. I think that's crucially important. And a lot has been done there. I mean, 10 years ago, I think a lot of Europeans thought about Asia policy as China policy. Now there's a lot more contact, you know, with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others. So long may that continue. But I think let's focus on those areas where we really can make progress and ensure that democracies are in a more competitive position globally.
You know, I sometimes wonder whether these sort of attempts by Europeans, including by the Germans, to say that they ought to have a security presence in the Indo-Pacific as well, is to signal to their own publics, more than to say the Chinese, that the security issues in the Indo-Pacific affect their trade presence and relationships as well. Honestly, I think that's the sane way to read these things, and that's not completely wrong. I think one shouldn't overestimate them. Do we have time for another question or two that we can then also turn into a final statement?
I think, yeah, I think so. Maybe
you're going to have to choose
one last question out of the many sent in, and why not bring it back to the very start and the introduction by the deputy mayor, because there were quite a lot of questions coming in on the role of closer cooperation between the US and Europe on the level of cities and local government, especially on strengthening democracy and strengthening rule of law and addressing climate change, which I found a very interesting train of thought that I mean, we have 2 more minutes left, but I would love our speakers to venture into.
Okay, great. Tom, I'm going to hand to you and then give Louise the final word.
Specifically on the role of cities in climate change, or just cities in general, or on these issues?
The questions came in on many different issues. Maybe the question would be, in transatlantic cooperation on the level of cities, what ought to be prioritized, and where do major sort of promising areas for cooperation lie?
Yeah, I mean, I could start off. I think one way to think about this is that there's a country-to-country sort of competition piece to all of this and providing public goods, but there's also a society-to-society piece as well. And so much of what we're seeing in the modern world engages people at all different levels within society, right? So competition with China plays out geopolitically. It also plays out when Beijing threatens to cut off all access for a European football club, right, from being able to show their games in China, and to put pressure on the league or on companies or individuals or cities in terms of exchange programs. So I think we need a societal sort of conversation about what people think their values and interests are that need to be protected in this modern world, and that then there's a greater understanding and show of solidarity at all of those different levels. So I think that would be my sort of major point. And I think beyond that, there's all sorts of things that can be done. I think clearly cities have a crucial role to play in climate change. And, you know, that's even more true here in the United States, where federal legislation is going to be incredibly difficult to pass. And if it's passed, it may get reversed. Treaties are basically out of the question. So the only real hope of progress we have is at the state and city level. And that's where it can be locked in and is more protected against future political shocks, right? So I think there, without a question, that's crucially important also.
Exactly. Louise, over to you.
Yeah, well, I think it's clear that, let's say, in 4 years, Trump and before that Bush, we've always said, oh yeah, we should continue our talks with the state level because a lot of energy policy, climate change policies are promoted there. We should cooperate with the companies that are willing, the US foundations that work on climate and energy, and the cities. So yes, definitely we should continue to do so. In the Netherlands, we have a climate agreement that was also established bottom up. But in all honesty, if I sometimes look at the real powers, for instance, that aldermen have and also the resources that they have to catalyze the energy transition, it's not that big. So in my own country, most of it still has to come from the federal level, I guess, although there's now also regional energy plans. But I think for the simple reason that indeed in the Senate, there might not be a democratic majority and that things may change in the future. I think it's important to keep the networks and to continue this effort to engage also with the societal and local government level in the US, and that requires also the EU side to be better organized, I guess. I guess you guys are more organized in that respect at the let's say, US federal level than we are currently. So that would be good to establish that. So now I'm having the word. I would also like to just quickly make use of this opportunity to thank you, Constanze, for the good cooperation, and also the municipality of The Hague people. It was a great pleasure to organize this, and I hope that we can continue working together also in the future. So just to end off, yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for letting me moderate. It's been a pleasure. I thought this was a terrific discussion, and apologies to the audience that we couldn't deal with all of your questions. We hope to continue writing about and speaking about these issues. So stay in touch with our websites, with what we do and write. I want to thank in particular Louise and Tom for engaging in conversation about this topic, for Thies, the co-author of the Clingendael report, for fielding the questions, and also for the people who aren't visible on this screen, but without whom organizing this wouldn't have been possible, our colleagues, and our research staffers and our communications people who made this all run very smoothly. It wouldn't work without them. And finally, again, also to our partners, the Municipality of The Hague and the Dutch Foreign Ministry, which funds the Breyer Lecture in the spring, and hopefully which will be able to do at some point when this damn pandemic is over. And with that, I'm going to say thank you to everyone, and I look forward to the work we continue to do together in one way or another. Thank you so much, and stay safe and healthy, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.